My name is Savannah Reed, and I'm 27 years old. Until that day, I believed that maybe, just maybe, if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, smiled at the right moments, and swallowed every little insult with grace, my father would eventually see me the way he saw the others. The family reunion was a tradition that had outlived its charm years ago. Every summer, my parents hosted it at our old lake house in Vermont, a place that once carried the scent of grilled corn, sunscreen, and laughter, now felt more like a well-decorated stage where everyone had a role to play, and I never quite knew mine. The house sat by a still lake, surrounded by tall pines and memories that I used to hold dear. But that July, even the trees looked tired. I arrived late, as usual. Not because I didn't want to be there, but because the hospital had needed me. I'm a trauma nurse in New York City, and that week had been long. A 15-hour shift, 2 critical cases back-to-back, and not a single thank you from anyone, except the woman who held my hand when I told her that her son would make it. That was enough. That always had to be enough. I'd packed my things in a hurry, thrown on a wrinkled dress, and made the 4-hour drive mostly on autopilot, convincing myself that this time would be different. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the smell of barbecue drifted through the trees, mixing with the sound of soft jazz playing from the porch speakers. A few kids ran barefoot near the lake, laughing, and for a moment, it looked like joy, the kind I remembered from years ago, before things became about job titles, investment portfolios, and whose children were the most impressive. I stepped out of the car, adjusting my dress in the side mirror, brushing my wind-blown curls back into place. My mother spotted me first, her smile soft but weary, as if she were already bracing for something. My siblings were there, of course. Grant, my older brother, with his custom-tailored shirt and sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Harper, my younger sister, was wrapped in a designer shawl, even though it was nearly 80 degrees outside. They looked perfect, as always. No one commented on my arrival. I greeted them with polite hugs, asked about their work, their kids, their plans. I laughed at the appropriate moments, avoided correcting anyone who said I worked in a clinic, and helped my aunt carry an extra tray of lemonade, even though my back ached from the shift. Dinner passed in a blur of noise, stories being retold, jokes I'd heard 100 times, and compliments passed like currency. I chewed quietly, smiled when spoken to, and told myself I wasn't going to let anything ruin the night. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to feel seen. Then came the moment. It always came. My father, standing at the head of the table, cleared his throat and tapped a spoon against his glass. "Let's raise a glass," he said, his deep voice commanding attention like always. "To family, because no matter where we go, we always come home." Everyone raised their glasses. I did too, though mine trembled slightly. "And I want to say," he continued, "how proud I am of each and every one of you." His eyes scanned the table slowly, like a spotlight grazing across a stage. "Grant, your promotion is nothing short of incredible. Harper, Forbes under 30. I mean, what can I say?" The table burst into soft applause. My smile held steady, waiting, hoping. "And of course," he added, pausing for effect, "I'm proud of everyone, except the failure." There was silence, like a vacuum sucking all sound out of the evening. And then, a few uncomfortable chuckles. My heart didn't sink. It turned to stone. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't need to. Everyone already knew who he meant. My cousin Kevin shifted awkwardly in his seat. My aunt dropped her fork. My mother placed a hand on my father's arm as if to stop him, but he brushed it off gently and added with a dry laugh, "Well, I suppose not everyone can be a star, right?" I stared at my plate. The roasted corn blurred on my fork. For a moment, I felt like a child again. Small, embarrassed, wrong. But something inside me didn't shrink this time. Something cracked. And through that crack, something much sharper began to rise. I stood up. No one told me to sit. My napkin dropped to the floor, and no one picked it up. My father didn't look at me. He sipped his wine as if nothing had happened. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I walked through the porch, down the steps, across the gravel, and back to my car. The sounds of the reunion faded behind me, Laughter restarting, the clinking of glasses, someone starting the music again. They went on without me. I sat in my car, staring out at the pines swaying gently in the breeze. I didn't cry. Not a single tear came. I didn't feel hurt. I didn't even feel angry. What I felt was something far colder, a silence so deep it rang inside my bones. And then I drove. For hours, I drove through the dark roads of Vermont, past towns I'd never heard of, through stretches of forest and empty gas stations. The further I went, the more a thought began to grow in me, quietly at first, then louder. He had done this for years, with words, with glances, with silence. He had measured my worth against the lives of others and found me lacking, not because I had failed, but because I had never played his game. I had chosen to care for people, to work nights and weekends saving lives he would never bother to understand. And still, I kept coming back, hoping for a sliver of affection, a single sentence of pride, but not anymore. That night, something inside me changed. I stopped needing his approval. I stopped needing his presence. What I wanted now was something else entirely. Not forgiveness, not understanding. I wanted him to see me. Not the version he had created in his mind, the failure, the disappointment, but the real me. And the only way to do that was to show him what failure truly looked like when it rose. He'd built his life on reputation, respect, and power. And I, the daughter he dismissed, knew exactly how to pull those things apart, piece by piece. He called me a failure. He had no idea what that word would cost him. After that night, something shifted permanently inside me. Not all at once. Vengeance is never born in a single spark, but like an ember that catches quietly and spreads until it becomes an undeniable flame. I drove back to New York with that fire growing beneath my ribs, not yet sure what I'd do with it, but certain that I wouldn't let it die like all the others. Not this time. The hospital welcomed me back with its usual chaos. Emergency room doors flinging open at all hours, patients gasping in pain, machines beeping endlessly, and my coworkers nodding at me in passing, too busy to notice the storm brewing behind my calm eyes. I slipped back into the rhythm easily, charting vitals, checking on post-op recoveries, changing bandages, holding hands during bad news. But I was no longer the same. Every break I had, every quiet moment in the stairwell or the corner of the locker room, my mind returned to that toast, to those words. Accept the failure. I told no one what had happened. Not my best friend Lily, not my supervisor, not even Marcus, the ER doctor who had been subtly orbiting my life for over a year now. He'd flirt, I'd deflect. He'd linger, I'd retreat. And yet, even in silence, he seemed to understand me better than my own blood ever did. But I couldn't let him see this version of me. Not yet. This was mine. I started doing something I hadn't done in years. I began researching my father. Not as a daughter, but as an outsider. I looked up every interview he gave, every award he'd won, every article that praised his work in cardiac surgery, his years at the Reed Medical Foundation, the board seats, the prestigious guest lectures. To the world, he was a pillar, but I knew better. I'd grown up watching how he treated people when no one was looking. His words could cut like scalpels, and his praise was reserved only for those who could be used as stepping stones in his reputation. I didn't want to destroy him for sport. I wasn't interested in childish revenge or public spectacle. What I wanted was to undo the illusion. I wanted him to feel what it was like to be invisible, to have the very thing he clung to most, his perfect image, slip through his fingers like dust. It began slowly. I created an anonymous email account and started contacting a few of the journalists who had written flattering profiles of him. I posed as a former assistant, someone who had seen things, but wanted to stay quiet. I didn't send anything definitive, just enough to make them curious, enough to make them wonder if there was more beneath the polished exterior. Then, I called a friend from nursing school, Emily, who had gone into investigative work instead of hospital care. I didn't tell her the full story, only that I needed help finding out where the cracks were. She was hesitant at first, but once I mentioned his name, her tone shifted. "Dr. Logan Reed?" she said. "He's untouchable. But if there's a thread to pull, I'll find it. And she did. Turns out, my father had a long history of pushing colleagues out of his way. Silently, strategically. A few doctors had been forced to resign quietly, without public explanation. A few interns mysteriously transferred departments after clashing with him. There were no smoking guns, no scandals with headlines. But the pattern was there. One of manipulation, subtle abuse of power, and reputation management so precise it was almost art. Emily compiled a file and sent it to me a month later. I read through it late at night, sitting in my tiny apartment with nothing but a single lamp and the sound of the city outside. Page after page of documented behavior, complaints that had never reached HR, whispered stories from junior staff, even one anonymous accusation from years ago that was buried under legal threats. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't just about me. He had done it to others too, but I wasn't ready to move yet. I knew if I acted too fast, he'd shut it down. He had connections. He had power. I needed to be precise. So, I played the game. I reached out to my mother one afternoon under the guise of wanting to talk. She met me at a cafe on the Upper West Side, dressed in a silk blouse and pearl earrings, her posture rigid as always. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I was surprised you called," she said, sipping her tea without sugar, just like always. "I thought maybe it was time," I replied. "Time to move on." She looked at me carefully. "From what?" I shrugged. "Everything. We talked for an hour, surface-level things. She mentioned Grant's new house in Cape Cod, Harper's engagement, and asked if I was still doing that night shift thing. I smiled and nodded, keeping my tone soft, pretending I was just the daughter trying to reconnect. I mentioned maybe coming home for Thanksgiving. She brightened slightly at that, and I knew the seed was planted. That dinner in November would be my stage. Over the next few weeks, I went back to work, back to quiet nights and loud emergencies, but my mind was always split, half in the present, half planning every detail of what was to come. Marcus noticed something was different. One night, he asked me if I was okay. I told him I was just tired. He didn't press, but he didn't believe me either. Finally, Thanksgiving arrived. I dressed carefully. Something simple, neutral. I brought wine, made a pie from scratch, and smiled at the front door as if the past summer hadn't happened. My father greeted me with a nod. My mother hugged me politely. Grant cracked a joke. Harper barely looked up from her phone. It was all routine. Dinner passed in the same rhythm as always. Chatter, wine, perfectly cooked turkey. And then, once again, my father tapped his glass. "I'd like to thank everyone for being here," he said, eyes gleaming under the chandelier. "Family is everything." And this time, before he could continue, I stood up. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and even, "before you start your speech, I thought I might say a few words." Everyone went quiet. My mother blinked. My father raised an eyebrow. I took out a single sheet of paper, unfolded it, and looked directly at him. "I think it's time we talk about what family really means. About what it feels like to be measured by someone who's never really seen you. About what happens when silence becomes protection for the wrong people." His face didn't move, but I saw the way his hand gripped the glass tighter. "I have stories too," I said, setting the paper on the table in front of him. "And I'm done being quiet." It wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. But it was the moment he realized the rules had changed. The silence that followed my words felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced in that house. For once, my father didn't have a response ready. Not a sarcastic retort, not a backhanded compliment, not even a cold dismissal. He simply stared at the folded sheet of paper sitting on the dining table, the one I had set there without hesitation. His fingers remained clenched around his wine glass, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that had scanned operating rooms and board meetings with the same ruthless precision, were unreadable for the first time in my life. I sat down slowly, letting the tension coil through the room like a live wire. My mother's fork rested mid-air, her knuckles white. Harper cleared her throat, awkward and uncertain. Grant stared at me with that older brother expression I had seen all my life. Half smug, half patronizing, as if he was trying to decide if I was being dramatic or dangerous. I let them all sit in the discomfort. I wasn't going to rush to explain myself or soften the blow. That time had passed. "You have something you want to say?" my father asked finally, his voice lower than usual, more controlled. I shook my head. "No, Dad. I already said it." "What is this?" he asked, tapping the folded paper without opening it. "That," I said quietly, "is the beginning." I saw a flicker in his eyes. Not panic, not yet, but the recognition that he was no longer the one writing the narrative. That night, I didn't elaborate. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply got up after dinner, thanked my mother for the meal, and left. I didn't look back, but what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the paper contained names, dates, incidents, small, subtle patterns gathered from people who had walked away from his world and were too afraid to speak. I hadn't sent it to anyone yet, but I would. I needed him to know it existed. I needed him to wonder who else might see it. I needed him to feel the slow crawl of doubt begin. A few days later, I received an email. No subject line. Just a message from an account I didn't recognize. "We should talk. You're not the only one. M." I stared at the screen for a long time. I hadn't told anyone what I had done. Not even Emily. So whoever this was, they had to be someone connected to him, someone who had heard or seen something. I hesitated for a day, then responded with a single line. When and where? The reply came almost immediately. Thursday, Cafe Amora. Noon. Bring nothing. Cafe Amora was quiet, tucked into a corner of Brooklyn near the park, and not the kind of place you'd accidentally run into someone from a hospital board. I arrived early, chose a table in the back, and waited. 10 minutes past noon, a woman walked in. Early 40s, tall with dark hair pulled into a loose bun. She wore no makeup, but her eyes were sharp. She spotted me immediately and sat across from me without a word. "You're Savannah," she said. "Yes. I'm Michelle. I used to be a surgical resident at Hudson Presbyterian. Your father was my supervisor." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the coffee cup the waiter brought. I waited. "He nearly ended my career," she said. "I stood up to him during a board review when he tried to shift blame for a failed procedure onto one of the interns. I didn't even raise my voice. I just asked questions he didn't like. A week later, my contract wasn't renewed. No official reason, just a letter and a closed door. I believed her instantly. It wasn't just her story. It was the way she said it, without drama, without expectation, like someone who had already buried the damage and moved on, but still carried the scar. "I read your note," she continued. "I have my own file." She handed me a flash drive and stood up. "You'll know what to do." And just like that, she walked out. That night, I opened the drive and found over 40 documents, internal memos, testimonies, meeting notes, private emails forwarded and archived. It was bigger than I thought. And it wasn't just about abuse of power. It was about manipulation, suppression, control. He hadn't just hurt me. He had left a trail of damage behind him, and no one had dared follow it. Until now. The next step was harder, because I knew that once I sent this file to someone outside my circle, there was no going back. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposure. About finally taking away the mask he wore so effortlessly. I called Emily. "This is more than what we planned," I told her. She paused. "Is it something you're still ready for?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes, more than ever." We agreed to send it anonymously to 3 sources: a well-known investigative journalist, an HR whistleblower line at the hospital, and a nonprofit that protected medical professionals from harassment. We didn't sign anything. We didn't leave traces. But I knew it wouldn't stay hidden for long. And I was right. 2 weeks later, headlines began to surface. Not accusations, but questions. Is the Reed legacy at risk? Anonymous sources raised concerns over Dr. Logan Reed's leadership. Then came the interviews. Former staff began to step forward, not all at once, but like dominoes. Quiet voices growing louder, backed by facts. My father didn't call. My mother sent a text. "What are you doing? Please stop." I didn't reply. Marcus noticed something had shifted in me. One night, after a particularly hard case, he leaned against the wall of the staff room and said, "You're different lately. Not in a bad way. Just like you stopped carrying something heavy." I met his gaze. Maybe I finally put it down. He smiled gently. "Whatever it is, I hope it gives you peace." But peace wasn't what I felt. What I felt was clarity, a kind of freedom I hadn't tasted since childhood. The weight of trying to earn something I never needed lifted from me like a fog. I wasn't his reflection anymore. I wasn't a failed daughter or a quiet disappointment. I was something else entirely. A week after the story broke nationally, I got a letter. No return address, just my name on the envelope, handwritten in careful script. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "You win. Dad." No apology, no acknowledgement, just surrender. And for the first time in my life, I felt nothing reading his words. Not joy, not guilt, not even triumph, just certainty. He would never speak of it. He would never admit what he did. But he would know, every time someone looked at him, that they had questions, that the myth was broken, that someone stood up to him and won. And that someone was the failure. There's something strange about freedom, especially when it comes after a lifetime of being told who you are. For weeks after receiving that letter, the one with just 2 words scrawled in ink, "You win," I found myself staring at it every morning as if waiting for it to change. But it never did. It stayed the same. Dry, bitter, restrained. A final act of control disguised as surrender. And yet, it was mine. A message not of love, not of apology, but of quiet defeat. He knew he had lost. That mattered more than any acknowledgement ever could. At the hospital, things didn't change. Not on the surface anyway. Patients still came in broken and bleeding. We still had to fight to save them, night after night, and I still had to push through exhaustion and adrenaline like everyone else. But inside me, something had shifted for good. For the first time in years, I wasn't dragging my worth behind me like a heavy suitcase, begging for someone to open it and say, "This is enough." That weight was gone. I walked differently. I spoke differently. I wasn't performing anymore. People noticed. Not in dramatic ways, no slow claps in the hallway or curious stares, but in glances that lingered just a little longer. In conversations where people stopped interrupting me. Even my supervisor, who had always seen me as competent but never essential, began asking for my opinion during meetings. It wasn't that I'd suddenly become smarter or more skilled. I was the same nurse I'd always been. The difference was I no longer doubted it. Marcus, though, was harder to face. Because while everything in my life was changing, I still hadn't told him the truth. He had no idea what I'd done, what I'd risked, or what it had cost me. Part of me wanted to keep it that way, keep that part of my life sealed off. But another part, the one that was slowly learning to trust again, knew that silence was just another kind of hiding. One Friday night, after our shifts ended, I found him sitting on the edge of the hospital's rooftop, legs dangling just above the service ledge. It wasn't as dangerous as it looked. The wall was higher than his knees, but the symbolism wasn't lost on me. He looked peaceful up there, staring out at the city, the glowing skyline reflecting in his tired eyes. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, stepping through the access door. He nodded without looking. "You don't usually seek me out." I sat beside him, letting the cool wind brush against my arms. "No, I've been busy, being someone else." He glanced at me, half smiling. "Well, whoever you've become lately, it suits you." We sat in silence for a few moments. The hum of traffic far below us felt distant, like another life. "I did something," I said finally. "Something big, and I haven't told anyone but one person." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. "I went after someone who hurt me," I continued. "Not physically, not even openly, but deeply, for years. And I exposed him." He didn't interrupt, just listened, the way people do when they're not waiting to speak, but actually hearing. "It was my father." Now he turned fully toward me. "You brought down your father?" "Not completely, but I cracked the foundation. He'll never stand the same way again." "Jesus, Savannah." I looked at my hands. I thought I'd feel something when it happened. Relief, victory, closure. but I didn't. I just felt clear. He was quiet for a while before saying, "That kind of clarity is rare, but earned." Like, we didn't talk much after that. Just sat together, letting the city breathe around us. Over the following weeks, I started doing things I'd always put off. I signed up for a weekend medical outreach program in underserved communities. I applied to a nursing fellowship I never thought I was good enough for. I even joined a support group, not for victims of abuse or trauma, but for women navigating complicated relationships with their families. For the first time, I began unraveling all the quiet ways my father's voice had lived inside me, long after he'd left the room. One of the women in the group, Clara, was in her 50s. Her father had disowned her after she married outside their culture. She said something one night that stayed with me. Sometimes we don't get healing. Sometimes we get understanding. And we have to make peace with that. At first, I wasn't sure I could. But the more I sat with that idea, the more I realized how much I'd expected closure to come from him. From a phone call, an apology, a tearful realization. But it never came. And maybe it never would. And that had to be okay. Because healing, I was learning, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet morning where your chest doesn't feel heavy. Sometimes it's looking in the mirror and not hearing the voice that used to tell you you're not enough. Sometimes it's smiling because you want to, not because you're supposed to. My mother tried reaching out again. First, a text asking if I wanted to meet for brunch. Then a voicemail saying she missed me. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but out of protection. I wasn't ready to let her back in. Not while she was still holding on to the man who had broken me, year after year, word after word. Thanksgiving came and went without another confrontation. My father didn't speak publicly about the allegations. He didn't sue. He didn't fight. He simply faded. He stepped down from the foundation quietly, citing personal health. His name disappeared from medical panels. The spotlight moved on. That was his punishment. Not disgrace, but erasure. And me? I kept going. Not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. I began to speak at local seminars about nurse mental health. I helped younger colleagues who were being overlooked the same way I had been. I mentored. I advocated. I lived. One afternoon, as I walked through the hospital corridors between rounds, Marcus caught up to me. "Hey," he said, a little breathless. "Got a second?" I nodded. He pulled out a small notepad from his pocket and handed it to me. Inside was a list of names, patients we'd worked on together, each followed by a single word, alive. "What's this?" I asked. "Your proof," he said, "of worth. In case you ever forget again." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it undid me more than anything else could have. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, holding the notepad, thinking about how far I'd come. Not just from that summer, but from the girl I used to be. The one who whispered apologies before speaking. The one who flinched at compliments. The one who measured her entire existence by a man who never really knew her. She was gone now, and in her place stood someone fierce. Someone still healing, yes, but standing, unafraid. My name is Savannah Reed, and I am not a failure. The day I saw him again wasn't planned. It had been almost a year since Thanksgiving, since the letter, since the quiet war that began at a dining table and ended in the slow undoing of a man who had worn his reputation like a crown for decades. I hadn't returned to the lake house, hadn't spoken to my mother in nearly 6 months, and the last message I'd received from Harper was a terse, "Hope you're doing well," which might as well have been a blank sheet of paper. I didn't mind. The distance gave me peace. And with that peace, I rebuilt my life, not from the ground up, but from the inside out. By then, I had finished the nursing fellowship. I was working on a small initiative focused on mental health support for trauma nurses, and I'd even spoken at 2 conferences, sharing my experiences, not about revenge, but about resilience. Marcus and I had grown close, not in the whirlwind way you see in stories, but in slow moments, quiet dinners, shared silences that didn't need explaining. A few months prior, he asked me if I'd ever want to leave the ER and move into teaching. I laughed at the idea back then. But now, I wasn't so sure. That Saturday morning had been ordinary. I went to the farmer's market, bought tulips for the apartment, and stopped by a small bookstore on 7th Avenue. I was browsing through the nonfiction section, running my fingers along the spines of books I wouldn't read but liked to pretend I might when I heard the cough. Dry. Familiar. I turned around slowly, already knowing. He stood just a few feet away, wearing the same tailored coat he had worn the last time I saw him, though it no longer fit as sharply. His hair had grayed more than I remembered, and there was a slight tremble in his left hand. He didn't notice me at first. He was thumbing through a biography, brows furrowed in concentration, unaware that the daughter he'd buried under silence was watching him in real time. I could have left. He hadn't seen me. I could have turned around, walked away, and kept that image frozen forever. The image of him older, smaller, no longer a man capable of hurting me. But I didn't. "Dad," I said softly. He flinched, just slightly, then looked up. When his eyes landed on mine, I saw something that startled me more than any insult ever could. Guilt. Not loud, not dramatic, but there, flickering just beneath the surface, where pride used to be. Savannah," he said, clearing his throat. We stood in silence for a long moment. I didn't offer a hug. He didn't reach out, and that was fine. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said eventually. "Neither did I. You look, well, I am." He nodded, looking down at the book in his hands. He didn't know where to put it now. Didn't know what to do with his hands, his eyes, his presence. That was new. "I've read about some of your work," he said. "The mental health program. For nurses." I raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know you were following." "I wasn't. It came up in an article. You're doing good things." I let the words hang between us, unsure whether they were a compliment or a distraction. "Do you want to sit?" he asked suddenly. "There's a bench outside, just for a few minutes." I considered it, not because I wanted closure. I had stopped needing that long ago, but because part of me was curious. Not about who he was, he'd already shown me that, but about who I had become in his presence now. Whether I could face the storm and feel nothing but wind. "All right," I said. We stepped outside, sat on the iron bench beside a planter of yellow pansies. The street bustled around us, life moving on without ceremony. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I know you probably don't want to hear anything I have to say," he began, "and I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it." I turned to look at him. "No, you don't." He nodded slowly, folding his hands in his lap. "When the stories started coming out, I thought it was all going to pass. That if I stayed quiet, it would die down. That's how things used to work. But they didn't this time. No, because someone didn't stay quiet. He didn't say my name, but he didn't need to." I saw the way his eyes shimmered with something he'd always been too proud to show. Fear? Regret? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. "I lost everything I thought mattered," he said. "The board removed me. The foundation is under audit. People I mentored won't return my calls. And still," I said, "you're here, alive, walking, breathing. No one dragged you through the mud, Dad. They just stopped pretending you were untouchable." He flinched again, and this time I didn't look away. "You once said you were proud of everyone, except the failure," I continued. "I lived with that sentence in my bones for years. But you know what I realized?" He shook his head. "That failure kept people alive. That failure rebuilt her life from ashes you left behind. That failure didn't need your approval to become someone." He lowered his head. I stood. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was done. "I don't hate you," I said quietly, "but I don't owe you anything." He looked up at me, eyes tired. "I know." I walked away then. I didn't turn back. That evening, I sat on my apartment balcony, sipping tea as the sky turned dark over Manhattan. I thought of everything I had carried, every echo of his voice, every wound that healed without apology, and I smiled, not because of what I had done to him, but because of what I had finally done for myself. I had broken the cycle, and now the rest of my life could begin. The weeks following that last encounter with my father were unexpectedly quiet, not silent like before, when silence meant being ignored or erased. This quiet was different. It was peaceful. steady, like the kind that follows a storm. Not because the world is perfect, but because the thunder finally stopped chasing you. I didn't tell anyone about the bookstore or the bench or the way my father's voice cracked when he said, "I don't deserve forgiveness." I didn't need to. That moment wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. A private ending to a story I had carried far too long. Life moved forward with a softness I hadn't known was possible. At the hospital, I was no longer the nurse people overlooked or underestimated. I was leading a project with a small team, organizing peer support groups and advocating for changes in our scheduling system to reduce burnout. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was just doing what mattered. And the strange part was, once I stopped chasing recognition, it started showing up without me asking. Marcus and I grew closer, not in a dramatic, sweeping way, but in something deeper, real. He wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but we shared something unshakable, understanding. He never asked for details about my past unless I offered them, and when I did, he never tried to fix it. He just held space. That meant more to me than all the declarations in the world. One evening, we were sitting on the fire escape of my apartment, eating takeout and watching the traffic below. It had become a quiet ritual. No pressure, no masks. "I was thinking," he said, licking sauce from his thumb, "maybe next spring we could take a trip somewhere." "Somewhere like where?" "Somewhere you've never been. Somewhere without memories." I laughed softly. "That rules out half the East Coast. Then we go west." The idea lingered. Not just a trip, but the possibility of rewriting the map of my life, choosing where I wanted to go, not where others told me I should be. That freedom was still new, still tender, but it was real. Around that same time, my mother sent another letter, handwritten again, longer this time. Inside were 3 things: a photo of me as a child, sitting on a tire swing, grinning wide, cheeks covered in ice cream, a note that read, "I should have spoken sooner. I see that now." And a key. No explanation. Just a silver key on a plain white string. At first I considered ignoring it. I had learned to live without her, without all of them. But something about the simplicity of it stayed with me. I stared at that key for days before curiosity finally won. I drove to Vermont on a quiet Saturday. Not to the lake house, but to a different address written in tiny letters on the envelope. It was an old cabin, small, 1-story, tucked between maple trees, the kind of place where silence didn't echo with judgment. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was empty. Clean, but empty. A single chair, a wood-burning stove, a stack of unopened mail. On the kitchen counter, another note. "This is yours, if you want it. I know it's late." Mom. No pleading, no explanations, just space. I sat on the floor, watching dust dance in the afternoon light, and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because she had fixed everything, but because she had finally done something that didn't center around him. This gesture was hers, and it mattered. I didn't move in, but I kept the key. And that, I think, is what healing eventually looks like. Not the return to what once was, but the decision to keep something that once hurt you at a safe distance, while still honoring the part of you that longed for it. Months passed. I stopped marking time by the dates of past wounds and started celebrating new ones. The day I got my first grant approved. The first time I led a seminar and didn't feel like an imposter. The night I told Marcus I loved him, not in a rush, not out of need, but because it was true. And then one morning, nearly a year after it all began, I received a package at the hospital. No return label, just my name. Inside was a book, a copy of Profiles in Courage by John F. Kennedy. It had once belonged to my father. I remembered the inscription on the inside cover, written in his precise handwriting, "For those who stand when others kneel." He had given it to Grant years ago. But now, here it was, in my hands, tucked between the pages, a note. "You were never the failure. I was just too blind to see you. I don't expect redemption. I just hope you know I was wrong. LR." I read it once. Then again. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just sat with it. And then I placed the note in a drawer, closed the book, and walked back into the ward to check on my patients, because I still had a shift to finish, still had people to care for, still had a life to live. That, more than anything else, was the real ending, not the fall of a man, not the revenge that sparked it, but the quiet continuation of everything after. A new beginning carved not out of spite, but strength. A year after everything ended, and truly after everything began, I stood on the edge of a new place in my life, one that didn't carry the same heaviness as the chapters before. The scars were still there, quiet but permanent, like the faded lines from an old burn. You don't forget where they came from, but they stop defining your reflection. Spring had returned to New York, and with it came new rhythms. The streets were alive again. Window boxes spilled color from second-story balconies. Cafes filled with couples and friends, with laughter and low conversation. I walked those streets now with ease. Not because the city had changed, but because I had. I wasn't searching the crowd for validation or bracing for shame. I wasn't shrinking when someone saw me. I had become someone who stood, not to be seen, but because I had found my footing. The nursing fellowship was over. I'd been offered a full-time leadership role in the mental health initiative I helped build, and I'd accepted. It wasn't glamorous. There were no magazine features or gala dinners, but it was mine. I worked with trauma nurses, residents, and new hires, helping them navigate the emotional toll of the job. I gave talks about burnout, about boundaries, about how sometimes the hardest thing is admitting you're not okay. And when I told them my story, not the one with my father's name in it, but the one where a woman remembered she was allowed to take up space, they listened. I still did shifts in the ER now and then, when coverage was thin or someone called out. I didn't want to forget what it felt like to hold someone's hand during the worst moment of their life. I didn't want to forget what first made me choose this path. It had never been about ambition. It had always been about people. One afternoon, after leading a workshop, I took the long way home. Past the park, past the old bakery that had closed during the pandemic, past the tiny bookstore where I had last seen my father. The bench was still there. A couple sat there now, eating ice cream and laughing at something one of them had said. I didn't stop, but I let the moment settle in me, a reminder that spaces change, memories soften, and life keeps moving forward. The letter he had sent, "You were never the failure," was still in my drawer. I hadn't looked at it since the day it arrived. I didn't need to. The point wasn't what he had written, but what I no longer waited for. There was no apology that could rewrite the past. But there was a life I could continue building without the weight of it. Marcus and I had moved in together in early March. It wasn't some big decision with speeches and candles. It was a Saturday where he looked around his place, looked at mine, and said, "Why are we paying 2 rents to eat dinner in the same apartment every night?" I laughed. And that night, he brought his books, his records, and his old scratched coffee table that I pretended to hate but secretly loved. We weren't perfect. He left socks everywhere. I tended to close myself off when things got hard. But we were learning. We were honest. And more than anything, we were kind to each other. That, I had learned, was everything. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I still heard my father's voice. Not the cruel one from the reunion, not the distant one from my childhood, but the voice of a man who had lost the version of control he once held. And with it, maybe, the chance to truly know his daughter. I didn't hate him. I didn't forgive him either. But I had let go of the need for him to change. That, more than anything, had freed me. The cabin in Vermont stayed untouched for months after my mother mailed me the key. Then, one weekend, I drove up there with Marcus, a bag of groceries, and a few books. We spent the entire 2 days without cell service. No screens, just firewood, blankets, and the sound of wind through the trees. On the second night, he sat across from me, sipping tea in silence, and said, "You know this place doesn't feel haunted." "It used to," I replied. "Not because of ghosts, but because of what I brought with me. And now? Now it's just wood and quiet. And me." That cabin became our retreat. Not a home, not yet, but a promise. That healing doesn't have to mean forgetting. It just means choosing not to live in the wound anymore. On the 1-year anniversary of the family reunion, I didn't go back. I didn't call, But I did write a letter, not to my father, not to my mother, to myself. I wrote about the girl I used to be, the one who sat quietly at dinner tables, who waited for affection, who molded herself to fit into rooms that didn't see her. I told her she was brave. I told her she had survived more than anyone knew, and I promised her she would never be silenced again. Then I tore up the letter, because I didn't need to keep it. She already knew. I think we wait for these cinematic moments, grand finales where everything is tied up with a bow, where the music swells, and the camera pans out on a perfect smile. But real life doesn't work like that. There's no theme song. There's just morning after morning, where you decide again and again that you are worth showing up for, even when no one claps, even when no one sees. And sometimes, the most powerful endings don't come with revenge or justice or closure. They come when you realize you don't need those things anymore to be whole. My name is Savannah Reed. I was once called a failure, and now I am free. Have you ever reached a point where walking away from someone you once loved felt like the only way to finally find peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your journey. If Savannah's story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real, powerful narratives about reclaiming your voice and rewriting your story. Maybe you know someone who's still living in someone else's shadow. Send this to them as a reminder that healing begins the moment we stop waiting for permission. Thank you for being here. And never forget, you are not defined by someone else's silence. You are defined by the strength it takes to speak, especially when your voice has been ignored for far too long.